Dozens of federal agents surrounded an apartment building in Chicago's South Shore neighborhood this morning. The area is bracing for a potential military deployment as immigration officials conduct raids.
Local leaders tonight are also demanding answers after an immigration raid.
The federal immigration officials say they have no plans to end their immigration.
Chicago just witnessed one of the largest immigration raids in recent memory, and the impact was immediate. In the early morning hours of September 30th, 2025, federal agents stormed a South Shore apartment building in a sweep that rattled the entire neighborhood. Residents described convoys of black SUVs filling the streets, helicopters circling overhead, and tactical teams in gas masks moving with military-style precision. By the time the sun came up, at least 37 people had been taken into custody. This was not a routine immigration stop. Officials say the raid targeted drug trafficking, weapons crimes, and immigration violations, all tied to a Venezuelan gang that has been slowly embedding itself inside Chicago's communities. The warning from DHS and ICE was chilling. This was not just protest or low-level crime. This was the footprint of Tren de Aragua, a transnational criminal syndicate that began in Venezuela's prisons and has now spread into American cities. The focus of the operation was an alleged network tied to Tren de Aragua, with activity concentrated inside the South Shore neighborhood. Federal sources say the five-story apartment building at the center of the raid had effectively been overtaken by undocumented immigrants linked to drug distribution and gang activity. Prosecutors identified at least 6 high-priority targets, all of them suspected gang members accused of trafficking narcotics, moving weapons, and exploiting vulnerable migrants for profit. According to DHS officials, this was not an improvised raid. It was the result of months of surveillance, wiretaps, and intelligence gathering that pointed to the building as a hub for both gang operations and immigration violations.
Agency Sting said to be the largest immigration operation that we have seen.
The mission, launched under the name Operation Midway Blitz, was not only about arrests, it was about sending a message that foreign gangs cannot take root in U.S. cities without consequences. The timeline of the raid explains why it shook residents so deeply. It began around 1 a.m., when federal convoys blocked the surrounding streets and tactical teams moved door to door through the apartment complex. Agents from ICE, Border Patrol, the FBI, and ATF surrounded the building and breached multiple units at once. Flashbang grenades echoed through the halls. Drones equipped with cameras flew ahead to scout rooms before officers entered. Children were pulled out of apartments as parents were zip-tied and led away. Neighbors who peered out their windows said the scene looked less like an immigration raid and more like the kind of urban warfare usually seen overseas. By sunrise, dozens of people had been detained. Suspects were loaded into unmarked vans, and the entire building had been swept from top to bottom. For residents of South Shore, it was a night they will not soon forget. And for officials, it was only the beginning of a larger federal crackdown aimed squarely at Tren de Aragua's growing presence in the United States. By the time the dust settled, officials confirmed 37 arrests, 6 high-priority targets, and dozens of others detained on immigration violations. DHS said the sweep was designed to take down gang members tied directly to criminal activity, while also removing individuals who could not prove legal status in the United States. Out of those arrested, some face immediate deportation proceedings, while others are charged with narcotics trafficking, weapons crimes, and conspiracy. Federal prosecutors explained that these were not random people swept up by chance. They were suspects identified in months of surveillance, names that kept appearing in intelligence briefings, and individuals already tied to Tren de Aragua's criminal web. The operation was part of a wider crackdown called Operation Midway Blitz, which has already netted over 800 arrests across Illinois. But in South Shore, the shock was magnified by the scale of the raid and the revelation that one of the world's fastest-growing transnational gangs had quietly established a foothold in Chicago. Tren de Aragua is not a gang that grew out of U.S. neighborhoods. It began inside Venezuelan prisons, where inmates turned violent organization into empire. Over time, it expanded into Colombia, Chile, Peru, and now the United States. Officials say the group is spreading in ways eerily similar to MS-13, embedding itself in migrant communities, blending into neighborhoods, and exploiting vulnerable populations as both victims and recruits. In Chicago, investigators tied them to robberies, trafficking, drug distribution, and violent turf disputes on the South Side. Intelligence reports describe them as opportunistic and ruthless, using extortion to control migrant workers, forcing women into prostitution, and smuggling drugs across city lines. Their model is simple: use migration pathways as cover, set up bases inside immigrant neighborhoods, and expand their network under the radar of local law enforcement. Federal agents now believe Chicago has become one of several U.S. hubs for the gang's growth. The raid itself produced more than just arrests. Federal affidavits accused Tren de Aragua, members, of using the South Shore building as both a safe house and a distribution hub. Inside, agents uncovered evidence linking suspects to narcotics and weapons trafficking. While DHS has not released a full inventory, officials confirmed ties to ongoing investigations involving smuggling networks and cash couriers who laundered profits through Chicago's immigrant corridors. The weapons connection is particularly troubling. Sources close to the investigation said some units in the building were being used to store firearms, while others were used to package narcotics for distribution. This dual use, drugs and weapons under one roof, is exactly what made the site a priority target.
This is a disturbing activity from the Trump administration.
For law enforcement, it proved that Tren de Aragua was not just a rumor or a name whispered in intelligence briefings. It was real, operational, and hiding in plain sight. The impact on the neighborhood was immediate and visible. Doors were kicked in, apartments ransacked, belongings scattered across floors. Residents described being jolted awake by loud bangs and the sound of boots pounding through hallways. Some families said their children were terrified as masked agents shouted commands and dragged suspects out of their homes. At least one U.S. citizen claimed he was mistakenly zip-tied and detained before being released, fueling debates about due process and collateral damage. But others in the community said the raid was overdue. For months, residents had complained about noise, suspicious activity, and unexplained visitors moving in and out of the building at all hours. Many said they suspected something criminal was happening, but they never imagined it would tie back to an international gang like Tren de Aragua. For South Shore, the raid was both a shock and a turning point, proof that the gang threat was not only real but already embedded in the very fabric of the neighborhood. Federal officials were quick to defend the raid, stressing that it was not a random sweep, but a targeted enforcement action against violent actors tied to transnational crime. DHS emphasized that the South Shore operation was the result of months of work, surveillance teams monitoring movements in and out of the building, informants reporting on drug distribution, and warrants carefully built to stand in court. ICE described the raid as surgical, saying the goal was not to terrify an entire community, but to remove those who posed direct threats to public safety. We will not allow foreign gangs to exploit migration pathways and endanger American neighborhoods, a DHS spokesperson said. Agents also confirmed the use of advanced surveillance technology during the operation, including facial recognition tools and drones, to ensure that the individuals targeted were the ones identified in prior investigations. For federal law enforcement, this raid was not only about arrests, but about proving that Tren de Aragua is firmly on the radar of U.S. agencies, and that they are willing to strike decisively when necessary. The reaction on the ground, however, was far more divided. Some residents said the raid brought long overdue relief, pointing out that for months, they had feared the building had become a hub of criminal activity. They welcomed the arrests, saying they felt safer knowing law enforcement was finally taking action. But others condemned the militarized tactics, describing the raid as traumatizing and excessive. Civil rights groups criticized the sight of terrified children pulled from apartments and families separated overnight. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker called the raids heavy-handed, and Chicago's mayor accused federal agents of bypassing local authorities in order to stage a high-profile crackdown. Lawsuits are already being prepared, alleging constitutional violations and unlawful detentions. For many, the raid exposed not just a gang presence, but also the deep divisions over how federal immigration enforcement should be carried out in cities that often view themselves as sanctuaries. The political fallout may stretch on longer than the operation itself, as local leaders spar with federal agencies over who controls public safety in immigrant neighborhoods. Despite the backlash, DHS officials are framing the raid as both a victory and a warning. 37 arrests in one night may not dismantle Tren de Aragua, but it sends a message that their networks are being tracked and disrupted. Officials compared the threat to the early years of MS-13, warning that if unchecked, Tren de Aragua could follow the same path, embedding itself deeper into migrant communities, recruiting aggressively, and turning quiet neighborhoods into staging grounds for organized crime. Already, the gang's presence has been documented in Florida, Texas, New York, and Illinois. Chicago, officials say, is simply the latest battlefield. For now, Operation Midway Blitz has slowed the group's momentum, stripping away manpower and exposing a hub that had gone unnoticed for too long. But federal officials admit the fight is far from over. The gang adapts quickly, its leaders remain at large, and new recruits are constantly arriving through migration channels. The conclusion is sobering. The battle against Tren de Aragua has only just begun. And unless enforcement continues at this scale, Chicago's raid will not be remembered as the end of the problem, but only the opening salvo in a much longer war.